It's my pleasure to introduce to you this afternoon Fred Hochberg. Mr. Hochberg ran the Small Business Administration in the Clinton administration and now runs a private investment company. He's also a great fan of Miami Book Fair and public radio, and it is our pleasure to have him here this afternoon.
My goodness, a lot of people here. I questioned why I was actually asked to make this introduction. I just said to one of the authors, I'm actually a practitioner, not a scholar, not an intellectual. And I thought about an introduction. I was given very clear notes to only speak for a minute or two, be very brief. And years ago, I was at a political event when Chuck Robb was running for the Senate for the first time. And the lieutenant governor introduced him and said, the essence of a good speech is to have an introduction that lays out what you're going to say, have a conclusion that repeats those points and goes back to the introduction, and to keep them very close together. So in conclusion, I want to conclude this introduction. I was in the Clinton administration, so I thought it's somewhat ironic that I would be introducing Christopher Hitchens, one of the most fiercest critics of the Clinton administration, Bill Clinton. And I thought, well, the only thing that he and I may share is this podium. So we'll find out in the next 40 minutes if that's true. And we're going to be here to talk about his new book, Why Orwell Matters. I'm also here to introduce David Reif and his new book, A Bed for the Night, Humanitarianism in Crisis. And we chatted briefly because I do some work on microlending in the developing world. The other thing I have in common with David Reif is I too have a mother in the field. And my mother's Lillian Vernon of the catalog business, and I worked with her for 20 years. So I have some idea what it's like to work in a field with a parent that casts a large shadow and also to have your own voice. So with that, I'm happy to introduce both Christopher Hitchens and David Reif. They're going to speak briefly. I'm then going to come back. We'll have questions from the floor. The point of today is to have a lively debate, which is what this country is based upon and what these books are based on, to keep it lively and contrarian. And I will be somewhat autocratic, however, to make sure questions are brief, crisp, and can be answered. And then in the end, I hope that you'll all buy their books, because that's the other reason we're here. So with that, let me introduce our two guests.
You want to introduce us further? Or shall I just...
The man in black is Christopher Hitchens, and he will go first.
Thank you for an admirably terse introduction, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters. Hope I can stretch it to comrades and friends. Good. For coming on such a beautiful day. David and I have decided that since the topic, the rubric of this is so elastic, that it will accommodate both of us pitching our own books. And I'm going to say why I think that where George Orwell is concerned, there's no time like the present, okay? And I'm going to justify it as follows. Those of you who saw recent developments in Mesopotamia and saw that Mr. Saddam Hussein Takriti had decided that what he needed was not just a vote, a referendum, but he needed 100% vote for himself in the referendum, and not alone that, 100% turnout in the referendum, and was able to achieve all these three things. In other words, to add what we, I think, can say very safely is his last episode of complete humiliation of his tortured and oppressed and immiserated and terrified people, to demand one more moment of them where they must acknowledge him not just as their leader, but as a god. One more moment of complete abnegation on their part and aggrandizement on his. Well, what is this but the total state? What is this but the Big Brother system? What is this but the horror of a regime which does not insist merely on compliance, does not demand only obedience, does not demand only conformity, but insists on applause, insists on support, insists on endorsement and adoration as well. The hysterical, sadomasochistic element that lies behind the power relationship, which George Orwell was so brilliant in evoking. I've been in Iraq a few times, and I've also been in North Korea. I'm well up on my axis, in other words. And I thought I'd read you just a short stave from what I wrote from North Korea before it became evident that the North Korean regime would again trouble our sleep by spending on uranium and plutonium and on weapons of mass destruction what it does not spend on its starving, wretched, tyrannized people. Here's what I wrote a couple of years ago when I was finishing this book. In the closing months of the 20th century, I contrived to get a visa for North Korea. Often referred to as the world's last Stalinist state, it might as easily be described as the world's prototype Stalinist state. Founded under the protection of Stalin and Mao, and made even more hermetic and insular by the fact of a partitioned peninsula that, so to speak, locked it in, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea still boasted the following features at the end of the year 2000. On every public building, a huge picture of the great leader, Kim Il-sung, the dead man, who still holds the office of president, in what one might therefore term a necrocracy, or a mausolocracy. All other senior posts are occupied by his son, the dear leader, Kim Jong-il. After all, Big Brother was a perversion of family values as well. Children marched to school in formation, singing songs in praise of the aforesaid leader. Photographs of the leader, displayed by order in every home. A lapel button with the features of the leader, compulsory wear for all citizens. Loudspeakers and radios blasting continuous propaganda for the leader and for the party. A society endlessly mobilized for war. Its propaganda both hysterical and, in reference to foreigners and foreign powers, intensely chauvinistic and xenophobic. Complete prohibition of any news from outside or any contact with any other countries. Absolute insistence in all books and in all publications on a unanimous view of a grim past, a struggling present, and a radiant future. Repeated bulletins of absolutely false news of magnificent production targets. A pervasive atmosphere of scarcity and hunger, alleviated only by the most abysmal and limited food. I had to eat a dog in Pyongyang. Finally, don't ask for doggy bags in North Korean restaurants, by the way. Grandiose and oppressive architecture. A continuous stress on mass sports and mass exercise. Apparently total repression of all matters connected to the libido. Newspapers with no news, shops with no goods, an airport with no planes, a vast nexus of tunnels underneath the capital city, connecting different party and police and military bunkers. There was, of course, only one word for it, and it was employed by all journalists, all diplomats, and all of the few overseas visitors. It's the only time in my writing life when I have become tired of the term Orwellian. I'm with my friend Martin Amis in his book, The War Against Cliché, or at least I'm with him about the title. I was once in Prague under the old regime, the old communist regime, and I thought, I'm going to get out of this, I'm going to write an article, and I'm not going to mention Kafka. I'm going to be the first writer from Prague not to do it. And then I went to this opposition meeting held in a private apartment, and the door fell in and the secret police were there, and I thought, never mind, I'm still not going to do it. And then they put me under arrest, and then I said, well, what's the charge? And they said, we're not telling you. And I thought, now I'm probably stuck with it. Well, that's what it's like trying to keep Orwell out of discussions of North Korea. I'll just finish my paragraph. In some respects, the North Korean nightmare falls short of Orwell's dystopia. The regime is too poor and too inefficient to provide telescreens or even wireless sets to most of its subjects. In some respects, however, it's infinitely more forbidding, Winston and Julia would have had no chance at all for a moment of private delight in the countryside, let alone the lease of a crummy flat in some anonymous proletarian quarter of town. Nonetheless, there really are hate sessions during breaks in factory or office work, and at an evening of mass games, I was shown via multiple hypnotizing flashcards the hideous image of a grim-visaged enemy soldier hurtling towards me, to be replaced by the refulgent and reassuring face of the great leader. These are details. What was entirely unmistakable was the atmosphere of a society where individual life is absolutely pointless, and where everything that is not absolutely compulsory is absolutely forbidden. The resulting dankness and dinginess and misery would have been almost indescribable without reference to a certain short novel that had been bashed out on an old typewriter against the clock by a dying English radical half a century before. Now, in getting three great questions of the last century, the century that's just banged shut behind us, the 20th century, getting them right, all of three of them, and being, I think, the only public intellectual who can claim to have done so, in other words, incorrectly diagnosing the end of imperialism, the rise of fascism, and the delusion or hallucination of Stalin and of Stalinism. Orwell relied on some very excellent political intuitions and instincts, and I think he understood the pornographic element that lies at the heart of the exercise of power, partly from having been a policeman and a jailer in the colonies, as well as later in his life a victim and a persecuted person in Spain. But he didn't just bring political intuition to this, he brought a certain attitude to language and the relationship of language to truth. That's important to us as well. And again, just to keep my allusions, my references contemporary, or contemporaneous, as people for some reason now like to say. Anyway, to make them relevant to what we're talking about, all of us at the present, I would give you just two examples. One, I don't think in the next few weeks, whatever happens, that any spokesman from the Department of Defense will ascend any podium and refer to collateral damage. I think it's been put to sleep, that term. I think everyone's seen through it. Everyone knows how to wrinkle their nostrils or to laugh or to deplore or decry what we call euphemism. In other words, giving a pretty name to a nasty thing. They'll have to say civilian casualties, or they'll have to come up with another euphemism which will be laughed out of court, I hope, just as quickly. And I was impressed and rather pleased, I must say, to see that when collateral damage was in the process of being put out of business, that most people mentioned that it was the sort of thing that Orwell taught us to see through, that it was, as it were, an Orwellian moment. I'd like to say that I think the same may apply, because it's very easy for people to tell Orwellian isms or nasty euphemisms in other people's speech. They're not always as good at detecting them in their own. I should say that when I see someone holding up a placard saying, "No war with Iraq," or "No war on Iraq," I think you've probably seen this or heard that slogan, I have the same feeling. Nobody wants a war with Iraq, certainly not me. And no one's calling for one either, or proposing one. There does seem to be a quarrel with Saddam Hussein and with his regime, and it seems probably, to me at any rate, it seems an inescapable quarrel, unless one believes in coexistence with aggressive totalitarianism. But if you remember, the slogan of the 100% vote and the 100% turnout was, by the party and by the regime, "Saddam is Iraq, Iraq is Saddam." Let no one who holds up a poster making that confusion be unaware or unashamed, therefore, of what they're doing. So this is my case for the extreme contemporary relevance of Orwell, but I'd be very happy to answer any questions about any other aspect of his work, or to be challenged on anything else I've said. And again, thank you for coming, and we'll be at your service very soon. Ciao.
What do I do now? I wish I were as sanguine as Christopher, and maybe I'll talk about language instead of what I thought I was going to talk about euphemism having been banished. The most obvious example of euphemism on the administration's part today strikes me as regime change. I would have said war was quite a better description. I don't think we only make wars on countries where the ruler has 20% support, let alone 100% claim of support. My own view would be that in that sense, the demonstrators, although I don't much sympathize with them politically, are quite right. I don't think all Germans supported Hitler, and yet it seems to me war on or no war on, depending on your point of view, Germany would have been a quite accurate and non-Orwellian description. The issue, the more important issue, of course, is the justice of that war on the one side, and its advisability on the other. That is to say, the people like me who would have no objection to Saddam Hussein taking a 9mm bullet in the eye, but who still think it's quite unwise to launch this war for all kinds of reasons of the effects it will have on the region and perhaps even on this country. I've written a book on humanitarian aid, more or less in an effort to make a slightly different case from one I think being made either on the left or the right. Neither term seems to me very useful in 2002. It's a sentimental term, and sentiment, in my view, is a prophylactic against thought. I wrote a book basically on the proposition that not all good things go together, and that if you like to come back to Christopher's absolutely correct emphasis on the issue of language, that one of the great Orwellian delusions of the age, if you like, is precisely that all good things go together. The classic version of this is the kind of UN or liberal foundation view, which is when it looks at a terrible crisis, like, say, North Korea, would say, well, what we need there is democracy, conflict resolution, open markets, and humanitarian assistance and human rights, as if this was all sort of a refrigerator full of admirable goodies that could be, if intelligently done, doled out in a way to produce regime change, a better world, utopia. Again, as Christopher rightly and sarcastically says, the radiant future, that promise of all totalitarian regimes, including Saddam Hussein's. In that sense, there is no distinction between Christopher's views and my own. My view is quite different. I think when you say all good things go together, which of course none of us believe in the private life, but since everyone more or less, or people too often, let me put it more modestly, check their brains at the door when they invoke their own politics, we talk about all good things going together in the public life. In fact, it's not true. I'll give you the example of human rights, which I think most people in this room, including the two people on this stage, would agree was a good thing, and emergency disaster assistance, about which one can say the same. Now, they sound like they go together. A lot of humanitarian relief workers want to be human rights workers. But the truth of the matter is they don't go together. A human rights worker is by definition a legal fundamentalist, a person who believes the law must apply to everybody, that there's a body of international law that prevents states from acting freely toward their own peoples, prevents them from torturing, from banning newspapers, from starving people, as the North Korean government is currently doing. Humanitarian, so it is a fundamentalist creed. You write, you go, you report, you condemn, you try to shame, you try to get other governments. Maybe you perhaps support the International Criminal Court and believe you're going to bring people to account. Christopher's written a very interesting book on that. Then there's humanitarian action. Humanitarian action is a 27-year-old water and sanitation engineer somewhere in the heart of some terrible conflict, surrounded by 15-year-old kids with Kalashnikovs, trying to feed people. Now, by definition, that aid worker must make compromises with butchers. You could say that compromise is the basic stock in trade of the relief worker, because otherwise it's just someone getting on his or her plinth and spouting agreeable sentiments. If you actually want to get the food to the people who need it, you have to do it in one of two ways. You have to do it on the backs of an intervening army, as for example the UN intervention in Somalia, or you've got to make deals with the local butchers, one or the other. And indeed the marriage of humanitarian relief with state power, as in Kosovo and Afghanistan, where humanitarian relief workers in effect became subcontractors to NATO, or for that matter, the marriage with the human rights organizations suggests that if you don't want to make deals with butchers, you have to call for outside military interventions. That's why the Bush administration is not being disingenuous or using a flag of convenience when it says that its goals in a place like Afghanistan, in a place like Iraq, in Kosovo, are partly humanitarian. That's not hype. They're perfectly sincere. The case I would make, though, is that in that situation, humanitarian action is always the subordinate, is always doing the saluting, and states are doing the ordering. And I don't think that's a good thing. In fact, I've written a book which is basically an appeal for a fundamentalist humanitarianism, that is, a humanitarianism much more like the International Committee of the Red Cross, that is strictly neutral. Now, to say this doesn't mean one couldn't support an intervention, whether it was in Mesopotamia, as Christopher picturesquely puts it, or in Kosovo, where I did support the intervention, but not, and I would argue, never on humanitarian grounds. One should give war back to the war makers and leave humanitarianism to the humanitarians. North Korea is a perfect example. The issue for a humanitarian in North Korea can only be one of two things. Do you call for a military intervention to topple Kim Jong-il? Or do you say, in order to get my aid through, I must work with Kim Jong-il and this regime that is exactly as Christopher describes it? This is, I recognize, not a very pleasant view of reality, but I actually think it's a preferable one to its alternative, which I would submit involves endless wars of altruism. And that, perhaps, is the worst Orwellian euphemism of all. Thank you very much.
Okay, we're going to open it up to questions from the floor. There's a microphone right here in the center. This being a university campus, I'm sure there'll be no bashfulness. So why don't we start? Just, if you would, also just state your name, and you might want to lift the microphone up because.
Steve, for David, how do you explain the laughably minimal amount of U.S. foreign aid, which Jimmy Carter likes to talk about very much?
Yeah. Well, the first thing to say is that all the polling data suggests that Americans believe they give a lot more foreign aid than they do. I mean, that's the first point that needs to be made. So on one level, it's simply a propaganda issue. On another level, I again think the Bush administration, which probably unlike a great many of you, I do not underestimate, and in fact think this president is going to turn out to be a very considerable figure, and that people who just laugh at his diction and his various missteps are very gravely missing the point of this guy, who is, I think, going to prove to be the second Reagan with all of the formidable qualities that entails. But leaving that to one side, I do think that the problem is that many people share the administration's implicit view, which is that we do the order the imperial ordering of the world. And the Europeans should do all that foreign aid stuff. I think that's a deep, ingrained view in the public. I wish it were otherwise, because I think the UN calls for that, 1% of GNP to be given to aid would radically change the world. I mean, I think it's very foolish in these post-Reagan, post-Thatcher days, despite all the admitted corruption of many states in the poor world, to imagine that a few $1 billion wouldn't help a lot.
Why don't we go to the corner?
My name is Jules Sales. Do you hear me all right? Mr. Hitchens, I'm having a little bit of difficulty keeping up with your fast British accent, but am I to understand that you are in favor of war in Iraq?
What's the bit you have difficulty keeping up with? No, I got the second sentence, but there was something you said you had difficulty with before. I was curious to know. In fact, I can't rest until I know what it is.
Am I to understand that you are in favor of war in Iraq?
No, that's the bit I got. You said there was something of mine you had difficulty keeping up with, and I have to know what it was. You're not going to say, all right. Someone will tell me afterwards.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, my view is that there will be a confrontation with Iraq, whether it is willed or not. This is for two reasons. One is the obvious one, the way that the Saddam Hussein regime has staked everything on, and really everything on its acquisition of weapons of genocide. And the other is that, for reasons I hinted at in my introduction, he's reached his Ceausescu moment. In other words, his extremely narrowly based regime. He's a member of a minority of the minority. He's a member of the Tikriti clan of the Sunni Muslim. It's now like a pyramid balanced on its apex, if you like. It's it's going to fall. It's going to implode. So all the problems of a post-Saddam Hussein regime are going to be with us in any case. And these are amply rehearsed and very often stressed. Everyone more or less knows what they are: ethnic and religious turbulence, undoubtedly a strong desire for revenge on the part of a number of people. The possibility that damage will be done to the oil industry, the oil resources of the country, rather than give them up. Many such things. These are all going to be with us in any case. In my opinion, both the most prudent as well as the most principled course is to deal a hand in this transition now and intervene as far as possible on the side of the Iraqi opposition and the Kurdish rebels, who have already in the northern part of the country created something like a civil society with a proper distribution of resources, with a multi-party system, and with an independent media. In other words, showing that it can be done. And those are my friends, and these are the people I've taken my side with. So yes, I am for a war with Saddamism, yeah.
Here.
Excuse me?
Is possibly this whole thing over oil and oil lines, pipelines?
The other slogan that I love is...
90% of it?
The other slogan that I've come to love, shall I say, is people saying no war. Sometimes they say no blood to make it sound better, but no war for oil. What can that slogan mean? Unless it means oil isn't worth fighting for or over. Well, I don't believe there's anyone who's so fatuous as to believe that. If there's anything worth fighting over, it's oil and who controls it. So I would say, in the words of a famous old statesman, never be afraid of doing the right thing if it also happens to be in your own interest. Saddam Hussein blew up the oil fields of Kuwait, I will remind you. He blew them up on his way out after he'd admitted defeat, after he'd finally surrendered his claim to Kuwait. He gave the order for the destruction, the immolation of the Kuwaiti oil fields, which flooded and poisoned the Gulf on top of that. If he acquires any further weaponry of mass destruction, he'll be in a position to threaten to do that to the Saudi oil fields as well. if those oil fields were ignited or irradiated, which is another option he might be able to give himself with a dirty bomb device, as it's sometimes said, everybody in the world would be a lot poorer right away. I believe that these resources don't belong to Saddam Hussein and must not be allowed to fall under his control. I think it's as simple as that. And though he would like to find out what it would be like to blackmail the world in this way, I think he isn't going to, and I certainly don't think he should be allowed to discover what the joys of that sensation would be. So yes, I'm for a war for oil as well, yeah.
This question is addressed really to both speakers.
What is your name?
Oh, the name is Frank Blecker.
I don't want to know his name.
Can we really win the war on terrorism? The United Nations says there's 2.8 billion people on the planet who are living in utter poverty at less than $1 a day. And they literally have not even entered the 20th century, namely the 21st century. I believe there's leaders all over available to take on this huge army and lead them. So can we really win this war on terrorism until we do something about the poverty, utter poverty in half our planet?
The short answer is yes, in my view. No, but all sort of ironies aside, I don't think there is a correlation between the 2.8 billion people living on less than $1 a day and all the other dreadful and shaming statistics that describe the world we really live in, not the world you see on Fox News or even in the pages of, dare I say it, the Miami Herald. What you say is absolutely right, of course, and it will go down as the great shame that at a time, what makes this time unique is, of course, one could do something. In the past, there was probably just as much poverty and suffering, but there was considerably less possibility for helping. One could clean up the water in the poor world with roughly $1 trillion expenditure. That's not a huge amount of money for a rich world. But I don't think there's any corollary at all between terrorism and these shameful phenomena. Terrorism is not found in Latin America in any appreciable way, in the sense that you're describing a war on the West, an attempt to attack. If you're just talking about criminal acts of guerrilla armies, those have existed since the beginning of time. And if we're really going to extend the definition of terrorism simply to every assassination, bomb in a bus, etc., then we're not talking about anything. But if you're talking about the modern phenomenon of terrorism, which is basically specific non-state actors using basically the methods of war criminals committing war crimes to secure political or religious ends, that's a very specific phenomenon. Doesn't it all correlate with poverty? The people doing it are intensely political. Their leadership is prosperous and comes from rich countries like Saudi Arabia. Their clienteles are people who have been given in or been seduced by a certain kind of Islamic religious enthusiasm. It's very specific. So I wish it were as simple. It's kind of the old, Marxist idea that it's all the material reality that determines this. But I don't think it is. I think it's the ideological reality of the Islamic world at this point, and by no means of the entire Islamic world, by a group of Islamic sects that have, to a very considerable extent, hijacked the Islamic world. I think those people can be fought. No war. Americans talk about war as if the outcome is certain. No war, the outcome of no serious war is certain. And this, probably unlike the war in Iraq, is a serious war. So will we win? I have no idea. Can we win? Yes, I believe we can.
Well, just a second, because I think the question was to both of us.
Yeah.
That's perfectly all right, my dear chap. Of course, David's right in saying that someone like Osama bin Laden is not a poor person. Indeed, I mean, his Al-Qaeda organization is, in effect, a bent multinational corporation run through crooked banks and front companies and so forth, as well as being a crime family, a cult group, and a fascist Camorra. And its members, as far as we know, are not attracted on the basis of their poverty and indigence. And you can imagine, if you want to think of the corollary, you have to imagine, say, Nelson Mandela or Salvador Allende calling on their supporters to use civilian aviation to inflict civilian casualties and crash planes into buildings. You know, you can't imagine it. People who genuinely care about these things don't resort to tactics of that sort. I believe myself that the victory over what we're talking about, that's to say theocratic fascism, is predetermined. It is an absolute certainty. Not because of any superiority that we have, whether military or moral, though both of those help. To have military superiority and an open society that can criticize itself are huge advantages, but because the victory of the other side is impossible to imagine. I mean, in the literal sense, impossible. What it demands is impossible. What it demands is that the Muslim world return to the desert and to the 7th century and live on the precepts of only one book. Well, even if every Muslim in the world decided they wanted to do that, they couldn't do it. And the evidence is that the majority of Muslims don't in any case. There's a civil war going on in the Muslim world at present between those who want to impose a bleak Sharia totalitarianism and those who do not. Those who want to do the former, those who want to impose a theocratic despotism, hope to win this war and impress the waverers by bringing it to the West. They've made a terrible mistake by doing so because they've made an unsleeping enemy. And they've hugely, I think, improved the chances that the civil war will now go the other way. But there would, even had it not been for the intervention of the forces of the coalition in Afghanistan, the Taliban regime would have imploded. It couldn't have continued to govern the country because religion is what it is. It is something, well, religion is a bit like living in North Korea, actually. It gives you many opportunities to praise the leader and to be grateful for everything the leader gives you. So, but it's not a way in which a society can be run. So I think one can say with absolute certainty that the victory over the terrorism we're talking about has in our minds been won already.
Yes. My name is Eric Spire. I have a question for Mr. Hitchens. William Safire, not known for his liberal views, just attacked Admiral Poindexter for wanting to establish a center for dossiers on every American in this country. Very much like a Gestapo file, central file. It's really a creeping Orwellianism that's happening in this country in the guise of national security. I was wondering if you have any comments on where do you draw the line?
Well, I was very sort of touched in a way to see that Admiral Poindexter was back. I knew that he hadn't gone to jail, and I remember being disappointed about that. And I remember having a special feeling about Mrs. Poindexter, who is the Reverend Mrs. Poindexter. I've never been able to find out in what denomination she's ordained, but anyway, I often used to think about the Poindexters and their home life and all that kind of thing. But I didn't expect him back in this capacity, and I thought William Safire wrote about it very well, because there's been a long struggle over the right of privacy in this country, and it's going to go on for a very long time. And I think those of us who favor the autonomy of the individual have just taken a bit of a hit. Not as big a hit, I think, as was taken, say, during the emergency death penalty and anti-terrorism act of the Clinton administration, which is still the one under which most prosecutors choose to bring arbitrary prosecutions. And the ACLU, if you remember, gave the Clinton administration the lowest score of any administration in history on civil liberties. There's been a tussle over, for example, the Patriot Act. I live in Washington. I've taken part in this tussle. Quite a number of libertarian conservatives have done a good deal of amendment to these acts. Roving wiretaps, things of this kind have been held off. John Ashcroft's just had to back off the idea of an official Secrets Act as well. He announced after a lot of lobbying and persuasion that he was determined that there was no need for such an act. So it's ridiculous to use the term Gestapo about this. And it would be a stretch, and believe me, I would have made the stretch if I thought it was worth it, to compare it with Orwell, too. I mean, I don't miss a chance to drag in Orwell when I can. I thought I would skip it on this occasion. When Mr. Lincoln decided to abolish habeas corpus during the Civil War, Washington was full of enemy agents, full of copperhead, pro-slavery supporters. I don't think it can be established that abolishing habeas corpus helped him to thwart that group, politically or militarily. And of course, the temptation to resort to such measures in time of war is very great. But we're not talking in the war in which we're actually engaged about free speech or free expression. We're talking about actual acts, and we do know that our society has been infiltrated, and we do know that it was done with great deliberation and ruthlessness and with murderous intent. And so I'm only interested really in debating this with people who I'm absolutely sure are sound on the first question. Okay?
May I just add that I noticed a lot of you applauded when Gestapo was mentioned. And I really would urge you to read a couple of books about Nazi Germany and regain your equilibrium. I mean, it is obscene to compare the Ashcroft moves, even if you think they are terrible, to the Nazi state. I mean, talk about abuses of language. That is genuinely obscene.
Well said.
John Ice, and actually I have two questions for Christopher. Being a Orwell scholar, if Orwell were here today, what do you think that he would find admirable and detestable about contemporary American society? And the second question is there a contemporary political figure that, in your view, embodies the vision that Orwell had of a just and secure society?
So you can just get applause for asking a question here. This is a very lenient audience, I must say. It's like the self-esteem programs in American schools. You're all so good at your work. You've all done so well. That's why you can't read. Well, your second question is easy. Orwell wouldn't. I mean, there is no one. It isn't a politician's job, in effect, to be an Orwellian figure. To describe someone as an Orwellian figure is to describe someone who, in a very determined way, refuses himself the lie, refuses himself propaganda, refuses himself euphemism or false consolation, and tries to face the world exactly as it is, and to report on it and its ideas with astringency. I suppose the only person in public life who would bear that comparison probably would be Václav Havel, I mean, who did for a while try to lead a life of that kind, and is a bad politician as a result. And just written, by the way, a very funny memoir of being president and how hopeless he was at it and how he got worse at it the more he did it. So, to which I commend your attention. I say in my book that Orwell's great weakness is America, in that having got the three great questions that I mentioned right, he failed to see the other great question of the 20th century, which is the rise of the United States. He admired its society, actually for something it now doesn't display much of, namely egalitarianism, because he thought that in the contest between liberty and equality, fraternity might be the thing that would make the difference, that could soften the contest. He admired America for that, and would probably have been disappointed to see there isn't so much egalitarianism now. He admired its literature and thought that its vernacular language showed an instinct for freedom, an instinct for liberty. He was correct about that, in my opinion. And suspected that it was harboring imperial designs. A question that hasn't yet been decided, or has it?
My name is Maurizio, and I have a question to Mr. Hitchens. My question is this. With the war with Iraq, how do you think it'll affect the conflict between the Israeli and the Palestinians? The war with Iraq, the aftermath.
Wait, you're not getting any applause for this? Okay, as if I'm not in enough trouble, the gentleman wants to know how I think a conflict with Saddam Hussein would bear out on the pre-existing tussle between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Well, the conventional wisdom is that the United States' position would be much stronger if it had concluded an agreement, or sponsored, co-authored an agreement on Palestine first. It would have more credibility with the Arab world. It would have taken, a very inflammatory situation off the, I'm not going to say off the chessboard, would have had an emollient effect on the region in general. And it's easy to see the temptations of that. The disadvantage of it is the following. If you say to Saddam Hussein, we can't do anything about you until we've settled the Israel-Palestine dispute, then you give him rather a lot of notice, it seems to me. I mean, here is, after all, at least a 50-year-old conflict, currently in a very, very inflamed stage. So, well, until we've settled that, we can't do anything about Iraq. That's giving him a long lease. The second, it's giving him not just the incentive, but the opportunity to disrupt it. And of course, Mr. Hussein announces his pride and joy at being able to contribute where he can to the suicide murder campaign, which has been launched by a rejectionist wing of the Palestinian movement, and which has indeed helped very greatly to poison the atmosphere. And in fact, Mr. Saddam Hussein said the other day that every time he reads of a suicide attack, he feels he'd been on the mission himself. And I always, when he said that, I thought to myself, I wish, I only wish. So the argument, shall we say, of the regime changes is this: if you take out the keystone of Arab rejectionism, emancipate its people and its oil, I might add, madam, help to reconstitute its society, the Palestinians don't have any further recourse to rejectionism. They won't, in the case of a breakdown in negotiations, say, well, we can always go to Baghdad and get support from there, as they have in the past, as Arafat's often done in the past. That option won't any longer exist. That might have a very good pedagogic effect on the negotiations, that's to say, on the Palestinian side. And in such a case, it seems to me the administration can face the Israelis and say that in return for a signed and checkable territorial settlement agreement, some of the settlements just have to come down. And this is the first president to use the words Palestinian and state in the same sentence. So that promise is implied in everything he does. And that's what I hope. Those are the two scenarios, and of the two, it seems to me that this one has a better chance of success than the proven failure of the Oslo Accords, which meant accepting everyone, including Arafat, at their face value.
Mr. Hitchens, I was wondering if you had thought of Osama bin Laden as a kind of Goldstein character, and if the U.S. had actually determined that he had been killed, if they would fess up to that, because he seems to be so useful as a boogeyman. Regarding collateral damage, I think I did hear Donald Rumsfeld use that term, and I believe it was when the UN determined about 2,000 Afghanis were killed in the fighting. And he said, what of course would be said, that that's what you can expect in war. Now, if we do have a war there, and if there is collateral damage, what would be an acceptable amount of collateral damage to have oil for less? Because I don't think that it's quite as you put it, that this is a war for oil, and what better cause would there be? Because it's not oil or no oil, it's a lot of oil or less oil, really. And so would 10,000 be acceptable? How many where would you draw the line?
Are you making me an offer? I say that only to show what a ridiculous question you've asked, but I won't dodge it. First, I don't think, well, I wish and I don't wish Osama bin Laden was right here now. If he was here now, I wish he'd heard himself compared to Emmanuel Goldstein. I think that would have ruined his day. Something tells me he wouldn't have wanted to be likened to a Trotskyist Jew. Something only a very few of us actually regard as a compliment, but I think he would think of as a great insult. No, he's not being used as a useful bogeyman, as you implied. I must say, I think there's an absurdity lurking there too. If you think that the United States government thinks, gosh, without Osama bin Laden, what would we do to keep people in line? I think you misrepresent reality very grossly. So no, I don't think it's a very good Goldstein comparison. Second, of course, Mr. Rumsfeld and others used the term collateral damage. That's exactly what I was referring to. I wasn't saying the expression wasn't being used. I was saying I thought it had been widely discredited. I don't think they'll try it again. And if they do, it must be criticized. But as in the case of Afghanistan, where it seems to me that even the highest number of casualties that I heard claimed on the Afghan side, this is, by the way, supposedly for non-combatants, though how it is determined, fighting against forces that don't wear uniforms, which of the dead is and is not a soldier of the other side, I don't know. I found all those totals very shady myself. But it was an extraordinarily, suppose it was the 3,000 claimed, that's an incredibly low price to pay for the destruction of the Taliban, the breaking up and scattering of the Al-Qaeda network, and the return to Afghanistan of, I think it's now between 1.5 and 1.75 million refugees. The population of Afghanistan has hugely increased, in other words, though there were those who said it would go down in case of a war. Many people, including humanitarian organizations, said there'll be famine, disruption, chaos. None of this occurred at all. We've bombed Afghanistan out of the Stone Age, in other words, which I regard as a great achievement. And I frankly think, though, that in one respect the casualty figures were too small. A lot of Al-Qaeda and Taliban people were allowed to get away. And I think too much was done to err on the side of caution in killing them and tracking them down. I want you to have no misunderstanding of what I mean here. And these people should be dead, because every one of them intends to commit appalling atrocities against innocent people in the future. I'm in favor of finding them and killing them with great expedition and ruthlessness. You asked me what the outcome of the war in Iraq will be. I repeat, I think it's an absurd question. But I see no reason to imagine that there will be much of a war at all, in that the Iraqi armed forces will not be able long to resist the intervention of the coalition. They're outgunned in every possible way. And that I don't believe the Iraqi people will rally behind their leader. And in any case, we know that in the areas of the country which are not under his control, the state of public opinion is what it is. An absolute determination to outlive this revolting dictatorship.
Yeah, I'm going to take the privilege of just adding something, not to reply to your questions, but even people who oppose the Iraq war on prudential grounds would tend to concede or agree with endorse Christopher's point about the war itself. The argument is about the aftermath. I don't think there are any serious observers of this situation who believe that, unlike the war on terrorism, which is going to be very long, very difficult, and involve a great many of the things that Christopher describes, which I would simply point out, if you talk about hunting people down and killing them without mercy, you're probably talking about committing war crimes, perhaps war crimes in a good cause, but war crimes under the Geneva Conventions. But I don't think there's any debate about the war itself. The issue is whether the country can hold together, whether, as the very great Iraqi dissident Kanan Makia says, this is the best chance Iraq's had for freedom in 40 years. So again, this is not just the Rumsfelders of this world who are saying this. One view, I think Christopher's view. Or the view of people like myself, which is simply that the risk of disintegration is not worth this war. But you know, when you start playing with numbers, all wars are about the slaughter of innocents. If you believe that war is licit, in other words, unless you are a moral pacifist, you must accept that war is not about anything. No war can be fought without creating humanitarian disaster, at least in the short run. Whether or not in the long run you improve things, that depends on the war. And slaughtering innocent people. That's what war is. That's its fundamental, that's inscribed in its DNA. And it's on that basis that you should think about whether or not you support a war. And I say this as someone who's supported a number of wars and seen a lot more.
Mr. Hitchens, are you hopeful at all that Henry Kissinger will be brought to trial sometime in his lifetime?
Well, the question was whether I hope to see Henry Kissinger brought to trial. Yeah, I mean, I used to hope he would die, and now I hope he lives, because I think that there's every chance that some of it will catch up to him. I can give you an update at any rate. On Memorial Day last year, I'm proud to say just after my book came out in French, he was visited by the gendarmerie in the Ritz Hotel in Paris on a good warrant from Judge Leloir, and served a summons to appear as a witness in a hearing about the disappeared French people in Chile, of whom there are quite a number. He chose not to answer the summons and fled town, but it's still extant when he goes back to France. So that's one of the countries he now can't go to. The Brazilian government recently, before the last election, that is, the last Brazilian election, the Brazilian government asked him to cancel a visit that he'd been invited to make there on the grounds that his immunity from prosecution couldn't be guaranteed. The judge in the Pinochet case in Chile, the great Judge Guzman, has sent him a summons for questioning. So has Judge Rodolfo Corral, the great judge in the case of the death squads in Argentina. The laws of many European countries, including federal Germany, have meanwhile changed so that it is the responsibility of any court to apprehend anyone wanted for war crimes or crimes against humanity wherever they are. And a sporting attempt was made to arrest Kissinger when he was in London last, but he left. The judge was considering it when he left. In other words, the atmosphere around the bastard has shrunk quite a lot. The oxygen is thinning around him. He can't travel and posture in quite the way he used to, and a lawsuit has been filed against him in Washington, D.C., in federal court, by the family of General René Schneider, formerly head of the General Staff in Chile, a constitutional democratic officer who didn't favor a coup against the Allende government, who was murdered, shot down in the street on Henry Kissinger's direct orders. His family has brought a suit for murder, wrongful death, in Washington. Every document in the suit, every document in the affidavit, in other words, of the prosecution, is a U.S. government declassified document. I think that's the first time that's been possible to say that. We have him cold, in other words. So the question is, and cheering though this is, I leave it as a question to everybody here. It's very nice to know that there are many foreign courts pursuing these questions, and it's nice to know that Chileans who've already suffered at his hands are having to bring their own lawsuit in Washington. But isn't it a bit of a disgrace that there's no U.S. government department, no congressional committee, no American district attorney who is thinking, why are we sheltering a wanted war criminal? Why is the United States a safe haven for someone wanted for crimes against humanity? It's an important question. I leave it with you.
I'm only here giving a second question because there's no authority at the moment asking a question. And this one, again, is directed to both speakers. A different topic. Is not the real reason that we are going after Iraq the oil? I know Saddam is an evil man and all that, but just 2 points. Iraq does have the second greatest reserves of oil. First comes Saudi Arabia with about 250 billion barrels, followed by Iraq with 125 billion barrels. We have control over Saudi with 30,000 troops and our troops. And we have good arrangements made with their oil. We like the same arrangements with Iraq. You say he's such an evil man. That's true, but remember, the government is secular. Women, for example, do get equal treatment up to, they all go through high school as men do. Saudi Arabia is not secular. Women, for example, cannot go beyond public school. Furthermore, if they're caught with the wrong attire on the streets, special Muslim policemen take care of them on the spot.
Well, David and I are going to do a division of labor on that. He's going to do the secular, and I'll do the oil again, in case anyone missed me the last time.
Right.
Because there was something I forgot to say. You may have noticed that the Saudi Arabian regime is opposed to regime change in Iraq, and it's the people who are its clientele in Washington, people like Brent Scowcroft and Lawrence Eagleberger and so on, are likewise very much opposed to this policy, as they should be, because if the Saddam Hussein regime goes, then the Saudi Arabian monopoly is to that extent broken. It's one of the many reasons that I favor regime change in Iraq. The Saudi Arabians have been using Saddam as their buffer state for a long time. They don't want their monopoly undercut, and of course Iraq's oil is currently being pumped with equipment that is perhaps 20 to 25 years out of date and in very bad repair, and the oil is going to the establishment of a parasitic, venomous, aggressive, totalitarian military caste. Emancipated from that, and with an investment of a couple of billion, it could probably start pumping more oil than Saudi Arabia, and more cheaply, and spread the wealth around a bit. But the thing I suppose that I like most about the regime change idea is that it would wipe the grins off the Saudi Arabian royal family's face. That's the bit I can't wait to see. Long overdue. They've been interfering in our internal affairs.
I quite share the bit about the grins, and those of you who will have seen the news reports this morning that the Saudis now seem directly implicated in underwriting the activities of some of the hijackers of September 11th may take the point about what Christopher means when he says interfering in internal affairs. About the secular point, I candidly, with all due respect, think it's a non-starter. North Korea is a secular state. So was Stalin's Russia, so was Hitler's Germany. You can make all the invidious connections you want about, comparisons, that you want about the conditions of women in Iraq and Saudi. But I don't see what you've done to either justify the regime. It reminds me unpleasantly of defenders of the Cuban Revolution in this country talking about, los logros, the education, the health care. It didn't change the fact that it was a wicked and totalitarian regime. What you're saying about women doesn't change that fact and remains one about Cuba, parenthetically. It doesn't change the facts about Saddam's regime. Secularism is not a free pass.
We have time for this one last question because we've got to break at 1:20.
Your comments about two things.
Well, we'll see.
Your comments about two things. First, you referred to a civil war in Islam. There doesn't seem to be much evidence of it, if by that you mean people standing up within the Islamic community and trying to reclaim their religion by condemning those who don't. And we don't seem to be doing too much to encourage it, given that right now in Egypt, apparently, there's a soap opera-like program based on the protocols of the Elders of Zion or including it, etc. So that's one thing. Second of all, I'd like your comments on Robert Byrd's criticisms excoriating the Congress for cowardice, for example, regarding the Homeland Security Department.
If you don't mind, again in reverse order, Robert Byrd is a ham and a phony. And a master of corruption and pork barrelism and a clown. And nothing he says makes any difference or is intended to. On the Civil War point, what I meant to say was this. In Nigeria, for example, where there's an attempt being made to impose Sharia law, not just in the Muslim provinces, but on the rest of the country, i.e. on the non-Muslim provinces, there are many Muslim Nigerians who don't want, for example, girls to be stoned to death for becoming pregnant. There's a strong opposition to that, and then it's backed up by an even stronger opposition from non-Muslims. The people of Indonesia are not delighted at the destruction of their tourist trade by Al-Qaeda. Antibodies of that kind are to be found gathering everywhere. If you ask the Iranian people what they think about the Wahhabi school of Islam, you will have a rather more strenuous criticism of its tenets than you will get from me. That's why no one ever mentions the Iranian street, by the way, you notice, among the anti-war movement, because the Iranian street, that's probably 70 million people, is entirely against Saddam Hussein, almost entirely in favor of regime change, and is about to depose the mullahs. That's what I mean. I mean, I could give you more examples. The willingness of Muslims to criticize their own religion isn't therefore necessarily entailed in what I'm saying. I mean, obviously, I would like a mass outbreak of atheism to occur, not just in the Muslim world, but I can't stipulate that as between Muslims who are for jihad and those who are not. I'm willing to make distinctions. The Egyptian showing of this scandalous soap opera seems to me to show, not to illustrate your point or mine, it's a thing in itself. It shows the opportunism of regimes like Mubarak's, the maneuvering they make between the low end of public opinion and the high end of American military aid. I do agree, maneuvering with one ought to cost them the other. Oh, please, it's okay. Go on.
I just have a quick suggestion. Hello? Yeah, okay. According to what I've heard you say, I would think that the way to minimize casualties would have Henry Kissinger take out Saddam Hussein and we'd be done with it. It would be easy.
Well, I was touched, as I'm sure you all were, by the offer from Mr. General, actually, Tayyar Yassin Ramadan, as Saddam Hussein's vice president, that there'd be a duel, a meeting of honor between Saddam Hussein and George Bush. And I don't know why the president didn't take him up on it, actually. So I have no doubt as to which one would walk away blowing the smoke from his Texan pearl-handled revolver. I wanted to just add something to what David said about secularism. He's, of course, quite right that the National Socialist regime was secular, though it did insist that every pulpit, Catholic and Protestant, celebrated the Führer's birthday every year, and the Vatican gave the order that every priest did celebrate the Führer's birthday from the pulpit every year, which is something that should be better known than it is. Saddam Hussein has recently added some verses from the Quran to his flag, usually has himself photographed or painted or represented at prayer or in religious garb, has made an attempt, I suppose some people would call it outreach, to represent himself in this way. And it's interesting to me because it bears on the question of his relationship to the Al-Qaeda network. I think they have a non-aggression pact that they concluded some time ago, rather as the Saudis did. They want the violence directed elsewhere and not at their own regimes. And I do think it's noticeable that whereas it can be debated the extent to which Saddam Hussein supports Al-Qaeda, the extent to which the bin Ladenists support Saddam Hussein seems non-debatable. They apparently regard his regime now as one of their causes. So I think that may be suggestive too. It was insufficiently pointed out that the Al-Qaeda propaganda represents what it calls a war with or an attack on Iraq as an attack on a Muslim people or upon Islam. Ludicrous when you think about it. After all, the next regime will be just as Muslim. The Kurds are Muslim. In fact, they're Sunni Muslim. The Northern Alliance is Muslim. Hamid Karzai is a Muslim. It shows the utter absurdity of religious propaganda, but I guess we knew that going in.
I think in the spirit of this being around lunchtime, that should conclude today. What you heard here was a mere appetizer, a first course. The main course is available outside. These two gentlemen will be signing their books. Thank you for joining us today.
If you are staying for David Rockefeller, I suggest you stay seated.